Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Jeff Carr about cybersecurity, cyber warfare, and the potential for cyber warfare between the United States and Russia. Mr. Carr is the author of Inside Cyber Warfare, Mapping the Cyber Underworld, and the founder and CEO of Taia Global, Inc. He has served as a cybersecurity consultant and is the founder of the Suits and Spooks Security Event Series. You can follow his work at jeffreycarr.com and at medium.com/@jeffreycarr. You can find him on Facebook under Jeffrey Carr and on Twitter @JeffreyCarr. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/cyber-warfare. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So let's start with some definitions. What is cybersecurity and what is a cyber attack?
Well, cyber is a prefix that has been attached to pretty much everything you can think of since the advent of the internet. And it's really become pervasive, and now it's sort of lost all meaning because cybersecurity has to do with security that is that pertains to how we interact in the digital world and on the internet via anything that's connected to a network. The thing that is important to note is that security is actually a holistic experience, and sometimes we forget about that, and we think that by connecting an antivirus to our computer that somehow we've managed to secure ourselves, when what an adversary will do is find whatever route it takes to be able to compromise your devices or compromise your privacy, and that sometimes doesn't require a computer. Sometimes it just requires a conversation. So cyber anything is in a way a disservice because it limits the conversation to something that's only digital, but really should be more expansive. And as far as a cyber attack goes, that has to do with somebody with a malicious intent that makes an attempt to access a network or a device that does not belong to them.
Okay, and one more definition for you. What is cyber warfare, and what might that look like?
So again, that's cyber warfare is actually, I define it as a component of warfare. So a good example is what's been going on in conflict between the U.S. and forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, between Israel and in its kinetic involvements with their enemies in Palestine and the Middle East. And so when you have a kinetic conflict, a traditional military conflict, one component of that today is a network attack. And so that would be that's probably the best definition of cyber warfare. In order to keep it clean, right? But what happens in mainstream media is that if a Twitter account is compromised, somebody will call that cyber warfare. Or if U.S. CENTCOM's website gets defaced, somebody will call that cyber warfare. And really, that's a misuse of the word, in my opinion.
All right. Now, when you say network attack, can you give us a little more detail, without getting too technical, of course, but give a little more detail on what that might look like and what that means and what sorts of vulnerabilities would be exploited in an attack of that nature?
Sure. So there's basically two ways that a network is compromised. By compromise, I mean somebody without permission accesses or gets inside of the network. And those two ways are either through email or through the website. So the the email avenue is what is most commonly seen in email is something known as spear phishing, where you'll receive in your inbox an email maybe pretending to be from your bank, and it'll say, you have a copy of your return check is attached, and you may very well click on that thinking, I'm not even aware of this. What possibly could this mean? And by opening that attachment, you have now infected your computer with a piece of malicious code known as malware. Alternatively, that email might say it might come from somebody maybe in your LinkedIn network, or maybe somebody from your Facebook, one of your Facebook friends, which an attacker was able to learn just by visiting your LinkedIn page or possibly by visiting your Facebook page. So they'll make the email look like it comes from someone you know. And it'll say, hey, Jeff, this guy has been talking about you and saying really awful things. Check it out, and it'll include a link. And of course, people being people, they're going to immediately click on that link thinking that this is legitimate. And that link will take them to either take them to a malicious web page. By that, I mean a web page that's been loaded with malware. So all you have to do is click on the web page and you're now infected. Or it might also be one of those things that we saw a few years ago when a hacker was going after actresses and compromising their phones, collecting their photos, and some of those being private, photos that they might send to a spouse or to a boyfriend, and include nude pictures. And so you would see on the web actually quite a bit of this, and you'd say, click here to see these photos of a famous actress naked. Well, that's a great trap because, again, people being people, you're going to click on that. And, of course, the moment you do, again, your laptop is infected now. If you're doing this at work, it's much worse because not only is your laptop, has your laptop been infected, but your entire network at work has now been compromised. So that's how bad actors typically will get inside a network. Just a simple trick to fool an employee to click on a link or open an attachment.
So what are some of the ways we've seen this on a larger scale and ways in which national security issues might come into play?
Well, probably the worst example on a national scale is what happened at the Office of Personnel Management, or known as OPM. So that happened. That happened. I think it was in 2015. They were compromised by a spear phishing attack, and OPM is basically it's the Human Resources Department for the U.S. government. And the reason why this particular breach was so devastating, in my opinion, the worst breach in American history, was because we didn't lose names and social security numbers and things like that for employees of the government. That's typically what happens, on a breach of a bank or a healthcare provider. You might even get, your medical information might be released, and that's all very difficult, of course, for the people who suffer that. Your credit might be affected. Your privacy might be invaded. But for OPM, what happened was the forms that government employees fill out to receive a security clearance. These are incredibly lengthy, detailed forms, easily over 100 pages. In some cases, they include trips out of the country. They include interviews done on an annual basis when your security clearance is up for review. There's just so much information contained in these forms that were stolen, basically, by everyone who had a security clearance ever, including me. And my clearance was way back many years ago, until after I left the service. And this was this compromised people that were working for any of the U.S. intelligence agencies overseas. The CIA, I believe, announced that it was recalling a number of its employees that were stationed in certain countries out of fear that they have been compromised. And that information, once it's gone, you can't get it back. So that's probably the worst example of what could happen in a breach if you are not careful about identifying your valuable data, the data that you absolutely cannot afford to lose, and protecting it in some way, such as encryption or keeping it on a server that has absolutely no connection with the internet, something that's known as being air-gapped. And even that is not 100% guarantee, but at least you have done your best to safeguard this valuable, incredibly valuable information. And that was not done by OPM.
All right, so before we move on to what has been happening between the United States and Russia, or what has allegedly happened from some claims and maybe hasn't happened from others, let's look at a couple more examples of where we've seen cyber attacks affect national security and take place on a national scale, or at least on a scale large enough to that national media attention has focused on this. And one of those issues I want to look at, one of those examples I want to look at was from maybe a year and a half to 2 years ago with this hack of Sony that allegedly, at least from media reports, was tied to North Korea. Maybe that wasn't necessarily the case, and the evidence was lacking. So what happened with the Sony hack, and was there any truth to North Korea or anything or anyone related to North Korea being behind that?
So that's a great example. That got lots and lots of media attention, of course. But the reason why it's a great example is because the U.S. government officially charged the North Korean government with being responsible for that attack, and then issued an economic sanction in reprisal. So that was an important precedent-setting event, because you have a lot of issues to deal with when it comes to state versus state conflict in cyberspace. If it's just a matter of espionage, then there's nothing wrong with that. But in the case of Sony, it was the destruction of property. And the other interesting thing about it was that because Sony is a Japanese company on U.S. soil, so there are certain complicating factors around that, and then of course the hardest part is attributing the attack, understanding who was responsible, because if it was a hacker group, such as what happened to Sony PlayStation back in 2011. Back in 2011, Sony PlayStation was attacked multiple times. I think they sustained something like 20 different breaches in a matter of 60 days. And the groups responsible for that were associated with Anonymous. Now, those were, so therefore we knew they took credit for it, and those are private actors, right? They were what we call non-state actors. So the U.S. government couldn't do anything about that. There's no provision in international law for a government to sanction another government if the parties involved were individuals. One government can only sanction another government if the other government did it, or if the other government had operational control over the actions of these non-state actors. So even though you had members of Anonymous from all around the world attacking Sony, you couldn't blame, let's say some of those members of Anonymous were Russian, for example, or Ukrainian, or Chinese, or Greek, or whomever, German. The U.S. government couldn't go to Germany and say, we're holding you responsible just because some German citizens were attacking Sony. The FBI might want to go after those individuals and do it with the help of German law enforcement, but that would be the only recourse. So what made the Sony attack in 2014, at the end of 2014, so interesting was that it was almost immediately decided that it was the North Korean government. And this is where the problems began. Attribution is very difficult. In my opinion, it's almost impossible, except unless the attackers make a lot of mistakes. So according to the Washington Post, within hours of the Sony attack, which was believed to be, the North Korean government was believed to be responsible because they had been upset about some ridiculous movie that was coming out, a comedy. And so we sort of leapt to the conclusion, by we I mean that officially as a country, that it must be the North Koreans. And even in the White House, according to the Washington Post, Lisa Monaco who's the person that was in charge of this, the interface between the White House and the intelligence agencies, had convened a session of the National Security Council and said, who do we think did it? And the consensus, with varying degrees of confidence, said North Korea. Some were convinced, some were not convinced, some said maybe, So the very next step that Lisa Monaco said was, or action that she asked them to take was, okay, well, let's find the evidence to support that. So right off the bat, you have a problem. This is exactly the opposite of what you would want to do when it comes to investigating a cyber attack. You don't make an assumption that I've been attacked and I think my some guy at work doesn't like me, therefore let me figure out how it is that he may have attacked me. We make a lot of mistakes in the court system when that's the way that evidence is approached. In fact, it would be thrown out. If the judge found out that the police just simply excluded everybody because they really just wanted to focus on this one guy. But that's what we do that's what we did in the case of Sony. When in reality, there most likely were a lot of people involved. Sony's network had been compromised for years, not just in the U.S., but in Japan and other places. There's plenty of open source material to that effect, but also we knew about the compromise back in 2011. And so they didn't the company as a whole never paid a lot of attention to cybersecurity. It was not a priority. And so there were a lot of parties involved, and you can't really determine who it is, that's engaging in this behavior. And so when the U.S. finally decided to issue a sanction against North Korea, they were very careful about how they worded it. So they never said that it was that the people who destroyed these servers that belonged to Sony were members of the North Korean military, because nobody knows that. What they did say was that that they are holding the North Korean government responsible, and that is sort of a tricky use of international law, which concerns me. Not so much that it was used against North Korea, because really, it's kind of everybody hates North Korea. It's kind of a criminal state anyway, and frankly, they don't have much in the way of resources to threaten anyone with. But it's extremely disconcerting when it's applied to a nation with massive resources like China or Russia or any of the other Israel or any of the other nations that may or may not be responsible for a certain attack against the interests of the U.S.
Yeah, let's talk about what has happened with Chinese actors or Chinese government affiliated actors, as well as U.S. actors and U.S. government affiliated actors attacking Chinese systems and Chinese networks. There's a lot of discussion in the United States about China and cyber attacks and cyber warfare and Chinese engagement in those activities. What's the truth about that situation, and what do we know about what has actually happened?
So you're asking for do you mean is China receiving attacks from the U.S. or are you asking about U.S. attacks that are sent from China?
China receiving attacks from the U.S., the U.S.
Right.
receiving attacks from China, so both directions.
Yeah.
What the attacks have been and what we know about them.
Right. So the OPM hack that I mentioned earlier was believed to have come from China. And in fact, the Chinese government said that they made arrests against the Chinese citizens that were involved in those attacks. There doesn't seem to be a record of those arrests, at least not when I looked a few months ago. I don't know what that means. I don't know if all of their arrests are made public or not, but that would be an example. China saying, well, okay, so it was probably somebody in our country that did it, and we're going to arrest them, but it was not us. So the funny thing about that is that there's nothing wrong with that attack because it was an act of espionage. It was an incredibly successful act of espionage, something that the NSA would have loved to have done had the shoe been on the other foot. And so, and there's nothing that either country could have done about it because those are the rules. Spies spy on spies, and there's you can't take offense at that, or you can't initiate an action in self-defense against an act of espionage. However, China didn't do that. They simply, I guess, what they wanted to do was not acknowledge that it was their MSS or their version of the NSA or the CIA that did it. So they said instead, okay, well, it was some Chinese citizens and we made the arrest. Conversely, we learned because of the Snowden leaks that the NSA has compromised Chinese infrastructure and Chinese companies as part of its mission to conduct espionage. So, in one case specifically, the Chinese company Huawei. So, China has not actually. I think China has unofficially condemned that kind of thing. They've never actually made it an official complaint, as far as I know. But again, because of the Snowden leaks, we know that the NSA is basically actively doing its job, again, but in a scale that I don't think anybody really imagined, against foreign governments, foreign individuals, and even foreign businesses, and in quite an aggressive way. So, and China is part of certainly one of the targets. So this is going on. It really just confirms what everybody has said, which is that cyber espionage, acts of cyber espionage are commonplace and widely spread, and pretty much against any company or government that is engaged in work of interest to another company or government.
All right, and one more example I want to get to before we spend the last little chunk of the interview on Russia and some of the more recent hacks and whether there's Russian involvement or Russian connections. But the last example I want to get to before that is the Stuxnet virus from around 2010 and its use against the Iran nuclear program. So what do we know about that, and how did we see network vulnerabilities attacked with the use of that virus?
So that was really the first. I think that was the first example of a publicly known cyber weapon. So if you define a weapon as something that causes a destruction of property, then that's what this did. That's what Stuxnet did. So. And it's believed that the U.S. Was responsible, and Israel is actually taking credit as well. So it was most likely an Israeli-U.S. operation. And at least one U.S. general, James Cartwright, has resigned and was under investigation for leaking information about the Stuxnet program to David Sanger, a reporter at the New York Times. Even though the U.S. has never officially said, yep, we did it, the actions taken by the U.S. government seem to indicate that, that we did do it. And the evidence compiled by Sanger in his book and in articles published by the Times are pretty compelling, so with a lot of details. So that seems like a pretty open and shut case. And it was designed to stop, Iran from enriching uranium, which would be used in a bomb or in some other type of a weapon system. It was not successful, however. It was only successful in crashing up to about approximately 1,000 centrifuges, but those were all replaced, and so it was kind of it's really a weird thing. We spent a lot of money and a lot of time, years and millions of dollars over a period of years to develop this method of attacking Iran's fuel enrichment program. And it just wasn't, it was just such a minor, it was really just such a minor setback for them that I'm not quite sure I understand the thinking, around this operation. But at any rate, the U.S. had the distinction of being the first known country or known government to use a quote-unquote cyber weapon against another government's facilities, and that would be the Stuxnet attack.
Okay, all right, so let's move on to some of the recent hacks that have been attributed in some circles to either Russian individuals or individuals affiliated with the Russian government. So what are some of the hacks that have been called into question? I guess in particular we've seen the DNC hacks and some of the WikiLeaks hacks, but what are some of the hacks in general that we're talking about here, and what claims have been made about these hacks?
Off the top of my head, I can't give you all that information, but it's easy to find. So it's sort of like a layer cake. This whole thing between the U.S. and Russia and the election. And depending on who you talk to, the cake has, 8 layers, or the cake might just have 1 or 2 layers. So in terms of attributing to the Russian government which attack is their responsibility and which isn't. But it starts off with this attack against the DNC, Democratic National Committee. They believe that they had a problem on the network. They called in a cybersecurity company to do the investigation. The cybersecurity company got permission from the DNC to write about it, and they laid the blame at the feet of the Russian government. So they identified 2 known threat actor groups, which this particular company labeled as Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear because they use animal names to represent different countries, and bear being Russia. Other cybersecurity companies have different names, but they're really all talking about the same groups. So by group, when in the world of cybersecurity, a group is simply, we don't know that it's really a group. We don't know that there are really individuals or that belong to that group. What we're really saying is that this attack or this series of attacks has certain things in common. Russian language used in the code, Russian tool sets, the compiling times were in line with working hours in Moscow. there might have been a Russian or Cyrillic characters in certain text that appears in the code, developer notes or something, and an email address or a server that was from a Russian-owned company. So all these little clues, when you have different attacks that have these same clues in common, they then create a group, a threat actor group, as people responsible for these attacks. So that's what we've got. That's where we started this process. The DNC hack and these two Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear threat actor groups. Then we learned that another organization, I think it's called the DCC, but it's a basically Democratic, the DNC version that serves Congress, and they suffered a hack, and apparently it was similar to what the DNC suffered. And then you had the release of documents taken from the DNC and given to WikiLeaks. And this is where much of the uproar came, because WikiLeaks started publishing these stolen emails. And now you've moved from what would have just been active espionage, which is breaking into the Democratic National Committee and stealing documents, to trying to influence another country's election. So the first one is legal, quote unquote legal. I mean, like I said before, an active espionage is not really actionable. But when you add to that the release of the documents and it becomes an attempt to influence an election, now that goes beyond what's allowed by espionage, and it becomes something that a government needs to deal with. And so the question then is, for the government to deal with this, it has to be another government that was responsible. If it was an individual, the way that it was that Guccifer 2.0, this allegedly Romanian hacker who stepped forward and said it was not the Russian government, it was not a group called Cozy Bear or Fancy Bear, it was me. I'm the one who did it. And you guys don't know what you're talking about by blaming it on the Russian government, and I'm the one that handed it over to WikiLeaks. So that got a lot of attention. A few folks, including a linguist that is my partner in a startup cybersecurity company, took a look at the writing of this guy Guccifer 2.0. And felt like he was not Romanian, that it was more likely that he was a Russian speaker, not a Romanian speaker, due to some errors in his writing. And so, but we still have this problem, which is, if it's just a Russian-speaking hacker, the U.S. government can't do anything. It has to be the Russian government in order for the U.S. government to act. And there is not a consensus in the intelligence community that it was, in fact, the Russian government. So that's why a month went by, weeks went by, a month went by, 2 months went by, and time just sort of dragged along, because there was a lot of debate based on published reports around whether or not we could really lay this at the feet of an intelligence agency in Russia. Finally, the White House decided that they would go ahead and publish a statement which said Russia is responsible. And that came from DHS and DOJ. And it was really a very carefully worded statement. It did not, unlike the one that was issued against North Korea, it was not accompanied by anybody from the NSA to support it. There was no indication that this statement was derived from secret or classified sources. The statement itself had a very weak support in its wording, which was that based on these activities, it's determined that only the Russian government could have been responsible. And that's just, in my opinion, complete nonsense. So in terms of the Russian government being the only one that could be responsible, there's certainly many more candidates that could have done exactly what we have experienced. And in fact, people have stepped forward and said, I'm responsible. On the one hand, it was this guy, Lucifer 2.0, but also Julian Assange has taken credit repeatedly for being responsible for releasing those documents at the times that they were released and doing it specifically to hurt Hillary Clinton. So you clearly have other actors involved here, other individual actors involved here, and not only the Russian government. And in fact, there is no evidence that even connects these attacks to a Russian intelligence agency. Absolutely zero. The only evidence suggests that Russians were involved, or I should say Russian speakers were involved. But, that's like saying, that's like going to the scene of a bank robbery and finding a Russian-made rifle at the scene that was used in the robbery. And are you going to say that it must be a Russian bank robber because he used a Kalashnikov? Well, no. I mean, nobody would say that. It's ridiculous on its face to exclude anybody other than a Russian shooter that used a Russian rifle. And yet we do that in cyberspace all the time. And so that's, that is a quick overview of what has happened in terms of this attack against the DNC blossoming into now a government-to-government conflict over this.
Sure. So, given the lack of evidence, and given the other potential actors that might be involved in this that cannot be dismissed so easily, why have these allegations against the Russian government been made, and why in some circles have they been made so strongly? Is it purely for political purposes, seeing as this is an election season and these hacks largely are affecting this election? Is it an attempt to tie Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin together? Why have these allegations been made?
Yes. So, my opinion is that it's purely for political reasons, that the White House has chosen to do this for political reasons under pressure from the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton, and also because they're afraid of a Trump presidency. And frankly, so am I. I mean, I think most people are, especially people that serve in the national security community, even people that have been Republicans for their entire lives in the national security space are saying that, we can survive a Hillary Clinton presidency. We cannot, as a nation or even as a world, survive with somebody like Donald Trump as commander-in-chief with the capability of launching a nuclear weapon. And so it's possible that somebody has convinced the White House that politically, potentially, even from a national security perspective, you have to do everything you can possibly do to keep Trump from winning. And perhaps one of those things might be to connect him to Putin and therefore connect Putin to the DNC hack. And, maybe that'll help swing votes away from Trump. So, again, that's all conjecture on my part, but I frankly can't see how you can eliminate political motivation from this finding against the Russian government. The other side of the coin is that, according to a recent article in Esquire, the company that was responsible for the DNC investigation, which is CrowdStrike, has played a major role in convincing the White House to go ahead and commit to that it was the Russian government. And so there is what I think a very dangerous and way too cozy relationship between private, for-profit cyber security companies that that make claims of attribution and the U.S. government. This is dangerous because they have a very highly motivated financial interest in making attribution claims against a nation state. So, because that's what gets them attention on a worldwide level. The amount of publicity that CrowdStrike has received for that report, that this was an influence operation by Russian intelligence services against the U.S., you can't even buy that. There's no amount of money that would buy you that amount of publicity and attention and making you the go-to company for large organizations, government agencies, and so on. Contracts would be incredibly big. And Mandiant, which used to do this with China, they basically CrowdStrike is following the same playbook that Mandiant followed back in 2013, 2012, 2011, where everything was blamed on China. And then in 2013, they were acquired by FireEye for $1 billion. It was, I think, almost 8 times what the company was worth. So, now CrowdStrike appears to be in a position that Mandiant used to be in several years ago.
All right, and I know we're already over time, but there are 2 more questions I want to get to very quickly with you. So, sticking with this situation between the United States and Russia, what are some of the threats that we've seen made by either side as relates to cyber attacks and cyber warfare, and what do you see as potential responses to these threats and these attacks if they're carried out?
Well, this was really, this was very, very unfortunate. I have no idea who's responsible. But right after the U.S. government issued that statement that they were blaming Russia for the DNC hacks and for attempting to influence our election, somebody leaked that the CIA was preparing options in terms of a cyber attack against Russia. That was on NBC News. I have no idea what the thinking was around this, but it's supposed, if it was going to happen, it's supposed to be a covert action, but it also has to be, by law, has to be proportionate. So what would that, what does that look like? A cyber attack against the United Russia Party, and then releasing emails from them. That would be proportionate. But however, the danger there is if the Russian government was not responsible for this, then you've got a case where the U.S. government has just announced that it's going to attack, and then did attack the Russian government. So Putin would be within his rights to respond, because he was an innocent party that had just been attacked, just like any government has the right of self-defense. So you could very quickly escalate, from something that never even happened in terms of the Russian government attacking the U.S. to now you've got actual attacks going back and forth between those 2 countries, all because a for-profit cybersecurity company who thinks that announcing attribution is a good policy, and the White House believed it. So it's a scary time, honestly, when you think about the potential for even an individual from anywhere in the world to create an attack that will look as if it came from a government that is already in conflict with another government. In other words, it's very simple to plant the false flag and immediately blame or have the blame placed on a foreign government that has bad relations, with the U.S.
So where do you see this issue of cyber warfare and cyber attacks headed? between the U.S. and Russia, but otherwise too, and what can be done to make sure that this doesn't get too far out of hand beyond even where we are today?
Well, fortunately, D&I Clapper, who is somebody that I respect, I respect his opinion, and I particularly respect his attempts to tell everybody to calm down when it comes to this particular event, has just issued publicly a warning saying that we meaning the U.S., has to be very careful about launching any kind of cyber attack because we are so vulnerable to a response. It's the old saying about if you live in a glass house, you don't want to be throwing stones. That's us. But in cyberspace, the U.S. is a gigantic glass house that pretty much anybody with limited resources can cause problems. It doesn't require a nation state's resources anymore. It would to engage us in the battlefield. It would to engage us on the sea, or in the air or in space. Obviously, of course, you would be a fool to engage the U.S. in that type of conflict. But when it comes to cyberspace, we are incredibly vulnerable to anybody, and that's why I think it's so dangerous that if the U.S. government decides that it can just start throwing cyber weapons at people over such, just such meaningless causes for action like this DNC leak.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me. There's obviously a lot that we discussed here and a lot of topics that I'm guessing many of my listeners are not familiar with. So if someone wants to learn more about what we've been discussing today or about your work in particular, what resources and readings would you recommend they take a look at?
I wrote a book. It's now it's in its second edition, although it's still a little bit dated. But there's a lot of good information in it inside Cyberwarfare. But probably the most my current work can be found on Medium, and also I have a website, jeffreycarr.com, and frankly, I'm always happy to receive emails from individuals that have questions about this space and just, share my opinion or what my experience has shown me to be true.
Okay, great. And I want to remind everybody to go take a look at the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/cyber-warfare. And linked from that page will be the jeffreycarr.com website and the book Inside Cyber Warfare, Mapping the Cyber Underworld, as well as your Medium archive and all the other resources we've discussed over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/cyber-warfare is the place to go for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast, as well as to subscribe and rate and review the show on iTunes or on Stitcher or another podcatcher of your preference. And all of those things will help you to stay up to date on what's happening and to not miss any episodes and get them all right away once they come out. And Jeff, thank you so much for joining me and helping me to take a look at these issues that are confusing to people like me that don't have a lot of knowledge in these areas necessarily, and I'm sure confusing to many other people too. So thank you for helping us to take a look at this and unmask what's going on here as best as we can. So thank you so much.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.